This is Plant-Based Briefing. Are Jains vegan? What do Jain scriptures say about dairy? An excerpt by Christopher Miller, PhD, at arihantainstitute.org. And I'm Marian Erickson, host of this curated-content plant-based podcast, where I narrate a variety of articles on plant-based and vegan living with permission in about 10 minutes or less every weekday. And I'm pleased to have permission to share content from a new contributor, the Arihanta Institute. Their mission is to build a world-class online institution for deeper learning of the Jain tradition, its principles, and how these principles apply to daily life for the benefit and well-being of individuals and society in light of today's most pressing concerns. Their courses are taught by world-renowned scholars and other community leaders, and the curriculum is comprised of 6 areas of learning: animal advocacy and biodiversity, climate change and environment, Jain philosophy, history and anthropology, social justice, yoga, self-care and spirituality, and professional ethics. And you may be familiar with Hope Bohanec, creator of the Hope for the Animals podcast. I volunteer with her on the Humane Hoax Project team, and her organization, Compassionate Living, is a partner of Arihanta Institute, and her husband, Kojin Bohanec, is on the faculty. And Hope and Kojin are amazing, compassionate, dedicated vegans, and Hope mentioned that Arihanta Institute has just announced their new Vegan Studies Initiative. It's a secular program, a groundbreaking online program focused on promoting and enacting veganism as an expression of multi-species nonviolence. The initiative interweaves graduate-level academic training, live and self-paced online learning courses, and public conferences and guest speaker events. Their mission is to educate, empower, and connect everyone who's passionate about reimagining and co-creating a world in which our values and actions converge. This Vegan Studies Initiative will have a free monthly speaker series, online classes open to the public, and an accredited master's program for those who want to dive deep into vegan studies. How amazing is that? I'll have some links to the offerings in the show notes. And you might want to check out the free speaker series. There are some amazing speakers scheduled. June 17th is Jan Dukowitz. He's a professor at the Pratt Institute and a contributing writer at Vox. He's written about the politics of food for The New Republic, The Guardian, The Washington Post, Wired, and The Wall Street Journal. They've also got other amazing speakers lined up, including Ed Winter's Earthling Ed. So check that out, and now let's get to today's plant-based briefing. Are Jains vegan? What do Jain scriptures say about dairy? An excerpt by Christopher Miller, PhD, at arihantainstitute.org. With a community commitment to a lacto-vegetarian diet that spans millennia, Jains have long been the torchbearers of dietary nonviolence. While a simple dietary commitment like vegetarianism may seem trivial to some, animal agriculture and the food it produces have massive and underrated harms on our climate, environment, human health, and of course, for the lives of billions of animals annually. Therefore, by cutting out meat, eggs, and honey from their diet, as lacto-vegetarian Jains typically do, Jains significantly reduce their impact in all of these areas. In more recent times, however, dairy consumption itself has become a more open and debated practice, both globally and within the Jain community. As my colleague Jonathan Dickstein and I showed a few years back, with their vows to nonviolence, compassion, and other spiritual commitments in mind, Jains of all ages are indeed rethinking dairy in light of the devastating scientifically proven harms that dairy production causes toward mother cows and their babies, the climate and environment, and human health. The question as to whether or not Jains should consume dairy has indeed become a hot debate in recent years, as many Jains continue to advocate for the continued consumption of dairy for a number of reasons, and despite all the aforementioned harms involved in modern dairy production. Though Jains advocating for dairy make a number of defensive arguments for continuing to do so, I will focus here on just one argument they use to avoid the cognitive dissonance that emerges when they're considering whether or not they should drop dairy from their diets: the cultural argument. To put it simply, the cultural argument goes something like this: Jains have always consumed dairy, and dairy is okay to consume in our scriptures, so why can't we consume dairy? As an ethnographer of religion, I start from the assumption that cultures, religious or otherwise, can and do change through history to adapt to their times. A major part of my training has been to track how religious cultures change to adapt, with particular focus on the Jain tradition. A central component of this cultural change involves, for many religious communities, a reinterpretation of their religious scriptures. And the Jains have been no exception, as Jain advocates for giving up dairy, as well as Jains advocating for dairy's continued consumption, both draw from their scriptural traditions to make their arguments. But are these claims true? And what do Jain scriptures tell us about dairy consumption? And can Jain tradition change? Dairy in Jain texts. Jains have historically consumed dairy, and Jain texts do indeed in many cases include dairy among their permitted foods, and do not necessarily include dairy in lists of prohibited foods. However, it is important to highlight that when these scriptures were written, industrial dairy and its harms did not exist, and so the concern with dairy was not as dire and important as it is today for Jains. Furthermore, there are particular prohibitions of dairy in Jain texts that are both direct and implied, especially when we consider what some of these texts might mean if we want to apply their spirit and teachings in today's complex world. I will provide us here with just 2 examples to show us that dairy was both directly and indirectly in spirit prohibited in some Jain scriptures. Direct prohibitions of dairy in Jain scriptures. A number of influential Jain ascetics, both monks and nuns in India, have begun to encourage Jains to give up dairy, based on scriptures like the following. Narrator's note: see the original article linked in the show notes for specific references and more details. Quote, he who eats milk, curds, and other things produced from milk and does not practice austerities is called a bad shramana, unquote, an ascetic on the spiritual path. Quote, honey, alcohol, butter, and meat are the great degenerative substances renounced by a holder of vows. In them arise living organisms of the lowest order. They are not to be eaten, unquote. Given the centrality of not only butter, but also other milk derivatives, including ghee, in the Jain diet, the decree that the foods listed here are not to be eaten carries much significance for thinking about contemporary Jain eating habits. It is also important to highlight that the dairy industry is a slaughter industry, and so by consuming dairy, one directly contributes to the killing of mother cows and their babies for meat, which is also forbidden. Similar prohibitions of dairy and its derivatives, due to their being considered degenerative, occur in other Jain scriptures, though for the sake of space and time, I turn our attention now to some of the implied prohibitions of dairy in Jain scriptures. Implied prohibitions of dairy in Jain scriptures. In addition to these direct prohibitions of dairy and its derivatives, Jain texts also provide guidance on how animals should be treated with an ethos of non-harming and compassion. Quote, the 5 transgressions of desisting from gross harm are cutting off limbs, binding, afflicting, mounting with an excessive burden, and withholding of food, unquote. And, quote, tethering, beating, piercing the skin, overloading, and withholding food and drink, unquote, are the 5 transgressions of Jain's vow to non-harming or ahimsa, which routinely occur in the dairy industry globally. Conclusion. In light of these concerns, many Jains express the hope that milk can be produced at its current industrial scale in a non-harmful way. Unfortunately, this is impossible. The idea that we can somehow create sattvic or ahimsa dairy at any capacity, as my colleague Hope Bohanec points out linked here, is a myth. Dairy cannot be produced without causing harm to mother cows, father cows, their offspring, the environment, and the climate. All dairy causes significant and often unimaginable harm, and the production of dairy thereby directly contradicts the spirit of the Jain tradition's commitment to ahimsa. But to answer a question I posted earlier, yes, cultures can and do change, and many Jains are giving up dairy and becoming vegan for all of the reasons mentioned in this article and more. In doing so, they ensure that their tradition continues to serve as the model of non-harming and compassion they have aspired to be for the world through the centuries, expressing through daily action their commitments to animal well-being, avoiding climate change, protecting the environment, and maintaining human well-being. These Jains show humanity not only what is possible, but also what is ethical and necessary in our shared times of global uncertainty. You just listened to Are Jains Vegan? What do Jain scriptures say about dairy? An excerpt by Christopher Miller, PhD at arihantainstitute.org. And I'm your host, Marian Erickson. Please do check out the show notes for a link to this original post where you can see more details about the scriptures mentioned if you're interested, and for information on the Vegan Studies Initiative and the amazing free monthly speaker series that's included with that as well. So please share this episode with anyone who might benefit, and thanks for listening.